L'occasione è duplice perché tra pochi giorni, il 9 novembre, saranno passati 33 anni dal crollo del muro di Berlino, un momento storico che ha segnato la fine della guerra fredda. Allora la speranza era naturalmente che l'Europa potesse finalmente essere in pace. Purtroppo oggi dobbiamo constatare che non è più così, ma anche l'occasione della presenza a Roma dell'ex comandante supremo delle forze alleate in Europa, generale Curtis Michael Scaparrotti, a cui do il benvenuto e che ringrazio per aver accettato il nostro invito. Thank you. A breve terrà una Lectio Magistralis proprio sulla sfida che attende la NATO da qui al futuro. Do il benvenuto naturalmente al segretario generale della Difesa, generale Luciano Portolano, che ringrazio per la sua presenza oggi qui con noi, al quale a breve affideremo l'introduzione ai lavori della mattinata. Io saluto naturalmente tutti gli amici presenti e le istituzioni, do il benvenuto al sottosegretario alla Difesa Matteo Perego, in bocca al lupo, questa è la sua prima uscita da sottosegretario, quindi gli facciamo un grande in bocca al lupo. Saluto naturalmente il capo di Stato Maggiore della Difesa, l'ammiraglio Giuseppe Cavodragone, Rolando Mosca Moschini, grazie mille, e Alberto Pagani e Stefania Grazie per essere qui, tutti gli amici davvero che sono venuti per questo evento. Ringrazio naturalmente l'ospitalità a Villablanca dell'Università LUISS e il prorettore per l'internazionalizzazione della LUISS, Raffaele Marchetti, al quale lascio volentieri la parola per i saluti iniziali. Prego. Grazie professore. Sì?
Ok, thank you. Grazie. Per noi è un grandissimo onore, è un grandissimo piacere avere il generale Scaparrotti, il generale Portolano e tutti gli ospiti, il sottosegretario, il capo di Stato Maggiore. La LUISS è un'università, lo dico soprattutto per il nostro ospite americano, di scienze sociali, che si occupa molto di temi di sicurezza, come ricerca, come didattica. Di fatto collaboriamo anche sia con il settore privato, la LUISS è collegata all'Associazione Industriale Italiana, Confindustria, ma collaboriamo ugualmente con gli attori pubblici, con il Governo, il Ministero della Difesa, il Ministero degli Esteri, e collaboriamo anche molto con la NATO, qui a Roma con NATO Defense College, con NRDC a Solbiate Olona, con SHAPE. Per noi questo è un evento importante perché ci permette di continuare a sviluppare l'analisi e la riflessione su temi centrali. Ovviamente il tema che affrontiamo oggi è un tema assolutamente cruciale per l'Italia, per l'Europa, per l'Occidente, per cui per noi è veramente un onore avere lei, generale Scaparrotti, come ospite per darci delle linee guida, delle analisi per gli ospiti. Siamo riusciti a far venire anche un po' di studenti, ovviamente qui gli spazi erano contingentati, ma mi fa piacere di avere anche degli studenti che saranno le future generazioni che poi tra qualche anno dovranno gestire in diversi ruoli queste tematiche. Non prendo altro tempo perché so che siamo un po' contingentati. Grazie veramente e buon lavoro.
Grazie professore. Bene, prima di lasciare il podio al generale Scaparrotti invito a raggiungere il leggio naturalmente il segretario generale della Difesa, Luciano Portolano, per introdurci all'incontro. Prego.
Grazie. Bene, buongiorno a tutti. Desidero innanzitutto rivolgere un cordiale saluto al professor Marchetti, prorettore per l'internazionalizzazione della LUISS, all'ammiraglio Cavodragone, capo di Stato Maggiore della Difesa, al neo sottosegretario di Stato alla Difesa Matteo Perego, al generale Mosca Moschini e naturalmente a tutti i rappresentanti delle istituzioni, del mondo accademico e dell'industria presenti oggi a questo evento. Vorrei inoltre rivolgere un ringraziamento particolare a lei, dottoressa Giacobbe, per avermi invitato a presentare il generale Curtis Michael Scaparrotti, che ho avuto l'onore di conoscere sul campo e al quale mi lega un forte rapporto di profonda stima e, se posso, di amicizia. Bene, innanzitutto per iniziare vorrei condividere con voi che nel corso della carriera ho improntato la mia leadership su 3 caratteristiche a mio avviso essenziali: il carattere, la competenza ed il coraggio, ma non tanto il coraggio fisico, ma quanto soprattutto il coraggio morale delle responsabilità nell'assunzione delle decisioni. E al riguardo ritengo che sia il carattere, sia la competenza che il coraggio di un leader sono qualità che per essere sviluppate presuppongono inevitabilmente esperienze in ambienti particolarmente complessi, ma soprattutto la presenza di qualcun altro con cui potersi relazionare costantemente. Pertanto, ritenendomi particolarmente fortunato, è con orgoglio che annovero tra i miei riferimenti professionali il generale Scaparrotti. Con lui ho condiviso esperienze irripetibili sul terreno a livello tattico e operativo, in ambito NATO Command Structure a livello operativo, ma ricorderà il generale Scaparrotti anche a livello strategico militare e politico militare, consapevoli entrambi di aver vissuto momenti epocali del percorso evolutivo dell'Alleanza Atlantica. Ho avuto l'onore di incontrarlo per la prima volta nel 2011, prima in BTC in occasione del -45 back brief a premessa dell'immissione in teatro operativo afghano e successivamente sul terreno. Lui comandante di ISAF Joint Command a Kabul e io al comando del Regional Command West ad Herat, quindi suo comandante subordinato. Avevo sentito tanto parlare di lui, laureato a West Point, dove peraltro è stato 69° comandante, ufficiale di fanteria dell'esercito degli Stati Uniti d'America e già comandante dell'82° divisione Airborne, ma quello che più mi affascinava e mi avvicinava del suo trascorso professionale era la consolidata expertise nell'ambito delle operazioni militari, avendo egli preso parte alle missioni Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Support Hope in Zaire e Ruanda, Joint Endeavour in Bosnia e Erzegovina e Assured Response in Liberia. E proprio nel 2011 la missione ISAF entrò in una nuova fase denominata di transizione o Intecal, per permettere al governo della Repubblica Islamica dell'Afghanistan di assumere la piena responsabilità e il pieno potere di iniziativa nel settore della sicurezza. Tale processo non si basava su scadenze temporali o calendari politici, ma si fondava su valutazioni congiunte dell'Intecal Board e della missione ISAF, valutazioni inerenti alle capacità delle Afghan National Security Forces di controllare il territorio sottraendolo agli insorti, e così presso un hotspot, il cosiddetto gomito del diavolo, ricorderà il generale Scaparrotti, nell'ambito dell'area di responsabilità a me assegnata, da sempre considerato un obiettivo sensibile per la presenza di elementi ostili, ho avuto il modo di apprezzare il preziosissimo supporto esperienziale e le spiccate capacità di pianificazione, ma anche l'intelligenza emotiva del generale Scaparrotti. Per dare impulso al processo di transizione fui autorizzato proprio dal comandante di IGC, proprio dal generale Scaparrotti, a dare inizio all'operazione Southern Slash. Per la prima volta le forze di sicurezza afghane, appartenenti al 207° Corpo d'Armata, operarono congiuntamente alle forze della coalizione NATO per garantire la sicurezza del settore a sud-est dell'area del Regional Command West, lungo una direttrice particolarmente sensibile per i traffici illegali. E ricordo la direttrice di Farah, Bakwa, Gulistan. E in tale contesto non mancarono azioni cinetiche per neutralizzare la presenza di insolti, ma riconquistammo, ricorderà il generale, un nodo stradale, una line of communication di primaria importanza per i rifornimenti dal nord-ovest al sud e al centro dell'Afghanistan. E ciò che mi impressionò particolarmente del generale Scaparrotti fu la vicinanza che mi dimostrò anche in quelle situazioni difficili in cui un comandante non vorrebbe mai trovarsi, e mi riferisco alla perdita di propri valorosi soldati sul campo. Ne piango diversi nell'ambito del contingente internazionale sotto il mio comando, tra cui 8 italiani, e consentitemi veramente pochi secondi per rivolgere a loro e alle loro coraggiose famiglie il mio grato, commosso ricordo, il pensiero e le mie preghiere. Al termine dell'impiego in teatro operativo afghano, il generale Scaparrotti avrebbe assunto altri incarichi, tra cui quello di direttore del Joint Staff e comandante delle forze americane in Corea del Sud. Tuttavia i nostri destini si sarebbero poi incrociati nuovamente dal 2016 al 2019, quando lui fu nominato comandante supremo delle forze alleate in Europa ed io capo di Stato Maggiore del Joint Force Command di Napoli nell'ambito del Command Structure dell'Alleanza. Quel periodo rappresentò un'esperienza significativa che ci portò a condividere il grande processo di adattamento e rafforzamento della difesa collettiva dell'Alleanza Atlantica dalla fine della Guerra Fredda, in risposta alla rinnovata assertività della Federazione Russa, all'evoluzione degli scenari operativi e alle incessanti mutazioni delle situazioni geostrategiche. Ricordo in quel periodo che secondo il concetto del Fit for Purpose furono avviate la NATO Readiness Initiative per implementare la cooperazione e l'interoperabilità tra le forze armate degli Stati membri e l'Enabling Plan for Secure Area Responsibility per il miglioramento della military mobility nel teatro europeo, a conferma dell'alta valenza strategica di iniziative quali l'Assurance Measures, la Tailored Assurance Measures for Turkey, l'Enhanced Forward Presence, la Tailored Forward Presence per i paesi del Mar Nero. E a seguito del Summit di Varsavia del 2016, adottando un approccio a 360 gradi, nel 2017 i nostri sforzi si concentrarono per la costituzione del NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, per analizzare e rispondere alle sfide, ai rischi e alle minacce provenienti dal cosiddetto fianco sud dell'Alleanza, ma anche e soprattutto per comprendere le traiettorie geopolitiche e securitarie del Mediterraneo, senza perdere d'occhio l'Africa ed il Medio Oriente. Adesso, nel commemorare tra pochi giorni il 33esimo anniversario della caduta del muro di Berlino, il contesto internazionale che caratterizza l'orizzonte della politica estera e di difesa europea è ancora interessato da una pluralità di crisi di diversa natura. L'aggressione della Russia all'Ucraina costituisce senza dubbio in questo momento l'elemento preminente di una crisi dal profilo ormai globale, dove scarsi appaiono i margini di una soluzione negoziata nel breve periodo. E in conseguenza del conflitto bellico in atto, una grave crisi ha interessato il settore energetico, colpendo in particolar modo l'Europa, soprattutto nell'ambito del settore del gas naturale, dove il rilevante ruolo di fornitura della Russia e la rigidità del sistema di trasporto via pipeline hanno determinato il rischio considerevole di riduzioni nei volumi richiesti dal mercato europeo. Ma a margine di questi macro scenari, a cui sicuramente farà riferimento il generale Scaparrotti, il contesto della sicurezza internazionale continua ad essere gravato da una vasta dimensione di crisi e conflitti minori che interessano soprattutto le regioni del Sahel, del Nord Africa, del Medio Oriente, oltre che al Corno d'Africa. Così come non meno rilevante è anche l'evoluzione della dimensione globale della minaccia che in modo sempre più deciso sposta i propri orizzonti nei domini cibernetico e spaziali, oltre che nei classici domini terrestre, aereo e navale, incluso anche l'underwater, con effetti strategici nell'ambiente fisico, nell'ambiente virtuale, nell'ambiente cognitivo, determinando l'esigenza di strategie ed approcci di nuova concezione per fronteggiare i mutati rischi e minacce acuite anche dall'impatto dei cambiamenti ambientali. In tale contesto ritengo che l'Alleanza abbia sempre dimostrato di essere l'istituzione che con i suoi adattamenti ha seguito in modo parallelo tutte le evoluzioni del sistema internazionale dal dopoguerra ai nostri giorni. E anche con la dissoluzione dell'Unione Sovietica, quando tutti gli attori internazionali furono costretti a rivedere la propria grande strategia, la NATO ebbe la vision di dotarsi nel 1991 di un concetto strategico, in primis per rivedere la sua stessa ragion d'essere, ma anche per superare la delicata crisi di identità adattandosi alla nuova situazione internazionale che gli permise negli anni 90 di proiettare i suoi valori ed il modello di democrazia liberale all'esterno del mondo occidentale. Con il graduale allargamento ad est da parte della Nato viene ridisegnato un quadro geopolitico mondiale con una serie di azioni diplomatiche e strategiche, ma non senza bilanciamenti e tentativi di rassicurazione nei confronti della Federazione russa. La fase discendente del nuovo ordine internazionale e l'associata instabilità dovuta alla crescente regionalizzazione della crisi porteranno nel 2010 ad aggiornare il concetto strategico dell'alleanza istituzionalizzando 3 core tasks: collective defense, crisis management e cooperative security. E oggi, nel nuovo concetto strategico della Nato 2022, pur riconoscendo la pariteticità dei 3 core tasks, è evidente un ritorno deciso ad una rinnovata attenzione alla deterrence and defense, a sostegno degli sforzi profusi nel tempo per la difesa di quei principi e di quei valori democratici. E vado a concludere. Nonostante tutte le critiche che ha ricevuto e riceve, ritengo che l'alleanza sembra oggi mostrare quella che alcuni commentatori definiscono una renaissance, a cui si aggiungono un maggiore investimento nella difesa aggregata e la gestione di esercitazioni congiunte su larga scala sempre più ambiziose, soprattutto in conseguenza di una percezione crescente e diffusa di minacce all'Europa. Anzi, sono del parere che quanto più le minacce le percezioni di minacce all'Occidente provenienti dalla Federazione Russa, dalla Cina, dallo Stato islamico, dalla frammentazione del Medio Oriente si acuiscono, tanto più l'Alleanza Atlantica sembra continuare ad offrire un ancoraggio istituzionale accompagnato da strumenti organizzativi e militari considerati essenziali per contribuire alla stabilità dell'area euro-atlantica. E su queste premesse ho il piacere e l'onore di cedere la parola al generale Scaparrotti. General Mike, sir, the floor is yours. Non so se ho preso il posto della moderatrice, ma...
La presentazione perfetta. Generale Portolano, prego.
Grazie, sir. Grazie.
Well, Luciano, thank you for that warm welcome and that very personal one. I have the greatest respect for your leadership. I've watched it in a very hot spot, and your country's fortunate to have you in the critical position you're in today. So thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to enter into the discussion with all of you at such a critical moment in European and global security. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion of this discussion with Flavio afterwards. I'd like to personally thank Formice, Lewis University, General Portolano, and all of you for gathering here today and taking time to have this discussion here this morning. Particularly, I'm honored by the Chief of Defense and Mr. Secretary, your presence today. I know you have both very demanding schedules, and it's really an honor to have you in the audience this morning. I'm also appreciative for the university's flexibility. As you may know, I was scheduled to be here in June, but due to some health reasons, actually COVID got a hold of me en route, and I had to cancel, so it's good to be here finally. It's always a pleasure to be in Rome. As the SACEUR, I enjoyed working with Italy's leaders and respected their principled and efficient way and their efficient approach to national and alliance security. We've always had a close relationship. This event today is dedicated to the commemoration of the 33rd anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and to looking ahead to the future of the transatlantic alliance. This is an apt moment for this conversation, to reflect on the history of NATO and to look forward. In 1989, European security was at a critical juncture, and it's more important than ever that we reaffirm our alliances and partnerships in the face of forces that seek to tear down the principles we hold most dear at that time: freedom, national sovereignty, and democratic self-determination. Thank you for the significant part that Italy plays in this fight. I want to commend the Prime Minister's commitment to the NATO alliance, as well as this new administration took its place. I have great admiration for the way that Italy is responding to the war in Ukraine, I must add, including through both humanitarian assistance and strengthened military readiness. I applaud Italy's decision to increase defense spending to the NATO 2% goal by 2028. But I would hope that you would reach it maybe a little earlier, perhaps 2024. I'd also recognize the significance of your welcoming over 170,000 Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers to Italy since the war began. And I commend Louis for establishing scholarships, I understand, for Ukrainian students. As a founding member of the NATO alliance and an instrumental player in European and global security, Italy has a critical role to play in shaping the future of European security and the implications from the war in Ukraine. Thank you for serving as an example of compassion, resolve, and purpose. Turning now to the topic of the day, I'll begin by talking about the origins of NATO following World War II, and then talk about the fall of the Soviet Union and a shift in NATO's mission towards peacekeeping missions and counterterrorism. I'll spend a good portion of my remarks on the resurgence of Russia since 2008 and the current war in Ukraine, how the war has evolved since Russia invaded in February, and the war's implications for the future of Europe and today's global security architecture. The Berlin Wall crumbled on 9 November 1989, nearly 33 years ago. This was a day of hope, not just for those in East and West Germany, but for our allies and partners across the continent and around the world who were fighting to overcome division and oppression. There were many long and near-term causes for the fall of the wall, including waves of mass demonstrations and protests, reform movements, and pushes for liberalization across the Eastern Bloc for years before 1989. But perhaps the match that ignited the flame for one of the most historic moments of the past 50 years was the question posed by an Italian journalist, Riccardo Ehrman, on November 9, 1989. That evening, Gunter Schabowski, an East German government official, delivered a press conference where he stated that, quote, permanent relocations can be done through all border checkpoints between the GDR, East Germany, and the FRG, West Germany, or West Berlin, end quote. Ehrman, who was working for an Italian news agency, ANSA, then asked Schabowski when the regulations would take effect, to which Schabowski replied, well, as far as I know, it'll take effect immediately, without delay. Well, Ehrman, years later, said that he understood the magnitude of that statement in the moment and immediately sent a message back to ANSA headquarters here in Rome and just sent the message, the wall is gone. Ehrman passed away this past December and is still remembered as one of the critical people who precipitated the fall of the wall. 33 years later, Russia's war in Ukraine reminds us that peace, freedom, and the right to democratic self-government, ideals that were just within reach to those in the East, those East Europeans in 1989, they're never permanently ensured. We're reminded of that today. These are principles that we need to actively promote and actively protect, together as unified partners. It was for this purpose, among others, that NATO was formed in 1949. While NATO was formed to deter and defend against the Soviet Union, NATO has remained a powerful and effective force because it's been able to continuously adapt its role and its capabilities in an evolving security landscape. Following the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, the main adversary against which the alliance was formed to counter was no longer considered a threat. Here in Rome in 1991, the NATO allies approved a new strategic concept that outlined NATO's new mission and purpose as a result. The Rome Declaration called for providing a stable security environment in Europe, which committed the members to keeping peace within the NATO alliance, and the surrounding countries in Central and Eastern Europe. The NATO alliance's shift towards a period of peacekeeping and humanitarian missions was quickly tested in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1994. NATO's operations in Bosnia were the first time the alliance had ever conducted live combat, marking a significant shift in the deterrent Cold War posture. NATO again showed its flexibility and ability to adapt its mission following the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. For the first and thus far the only time, NATO invoked Article 5 to come to the collective defense of the United States, aiding in the U.S.'s counterterrorism efforts and intervention in Afghanistan. NATO formally took over the UN-authorized International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, in 2003 and remained in Afghanistan for 20 years. Between 1998 and 2010, NATO conducted 53 peacekeeping operations, 4 times the number that it had conducted between 1949 and 1988, a significant change in its posture and activity. Another turning point, not wholly appreciated at the time, was President Putin's speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference. Putin stated his belief that the U.S. and NATO broke a pledge by stationing forces in Eastern Europe. He has pressed to restore Russian influence within the territorial contours of the Soviet Union and the former Warsaw Pact, and beyond, I might add. 1 year later, Putin annexed part of Georgia in 2008, then Crimea, then the Donbass. And in 2015, Russia deployed into Syria, and now, of course, their invasion of Ukraine. Now, after 2008, NATO again refocused its efforts on countering an increasingly aggressive Russia when it annexed part of Georgia in just a few days. In hindsight, it seems clear that Putin used Georgia as a dry run for future invasions, including Ukraine. Russia from 2008 onwards has been marked by renewed aggression and revisionist nationalism. Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and invasion of parts of the eastern Donbass in 2014 was yet another instance in which he believed that he had a right to take territory under what was formerly part of the USSR. Amid all of this, it's important to remember that NATO has been doing significant work to defend against Russia. The alliance is far more prepared today in this respect than when I held the role as SACEUR. And the historic changes that NATO has experienced over the past 6 years are not always visible to the public. We knew we needed to build a strong deterrent to affect Putin, and we put policies and procedures in place that NATO's response would be faster and be better. We built a great defense on the eastern flank. We practiced Joint Readiness Task Force. We expanded the authorities of SACEUR and the broader headquarters to act more quickly. And each of those changes came into play when Putin went into Ukraine this past February. In fact, I personally believe that NATO is more nimble than folks sometimes give it credit for, particularly when it comes to the important decisions with respect to its security mission. They have been able to act at 30. Yes, NATO has a better deterrent posture today than it did in the past. However, this doesn't mean that the need to enforce the eastern flank has disappeared. Despite Russia's many missteps during this war in Ukraine, we're not in a position where we should count Russia out. Putin and his government possesses an expansionist mindset, one they are willing to realize by force and through a large military with many capabilities and forces still in reserve. Putin is giving new life to the Cold War line, in my opinion, that the only border Russia likes is one with the Red Army on both sides. I'd like to now address Ukraine. First, it's important to note the terrible human toll of this conflict. There are nearly 12 million Ukrainian refugees that have been forced to flee their homes. Thousands of soldiers and civilians have lost their lives. Cities have been completely leveled by Russian missiles and artillery. And most recently, they've used Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones as well. It's a terrible tragedy that's happening there today, every day. Yet from day one, we've seen Ukraine come together and stand strong. President Zelensky has served as a model in unwavering and principled bravery for all leaders. We're watching Putin's army retreat. They've not performed well. Yet Putin is still operating as if he has options. He thinks he has time through the winter, that it'll be to his advantage, a cold winter, a hard winter. He still has almost all of his Air Force and his Navy intact, and he also has the largest nuclear force in the world. He's going to grab onto whatever he can to believe, to help him believe that he can obtain his original goals, but at a later date. So what are those goals? Well, Putin's invading Ukraine because he seeks to rewrite the post-Soviet era. Putin wants to reassert Russia as a global and European hegemon and to cement his legacy as the man who made Russia a global power after years of stagnation after the fall of the wall. While the final territorial outcome of the war is not yet known, what is clear is that Russia has become an international pariah. Over the next few years, it will be isolated and further ostracized by the West, in my opinion. While Ukraine may lose territory in the East, the rest of the country will likely further integrate into the West, receive humanitarian support, and I would hope a EU-led version of the Marshall Plan to bolster the country's recovery. Time doesn't permit me to touch more on China and the threat it poses to us all, but let me make 3 quick points. First, Xi Jinping and Putin share a desire to make the international order in a way that none of us would want to experience for ourselves, for our children, or for our grandchildren. An order that's defined by authoritarian rule in one party, one personality states. Second, President Xi and President Putin's no-limits partnership may be a hyperbole in the largest sense, but today, as China is bankrolling Putin's operations in Ukraine through oil purchases and providing credit and liquidity to the Russian economy. And then finally, third, while Putin's economy is struggling, China's GDP is 8 times greater than Russia's. Now just imagine what Putin would be able to field against Ukraine with a larger GDP, and you'll begin to imagine both the scale and the challenge that we face in China. As we reflect back and we look ahead, I'd like to highlight 3 lessons on warfare that can be distilled based on the conflict thus far in Ukraine. First, the nature of war. We're being reminded that the nature of war fundamentally has not changed. War is not easy, it's not fast, it is unruly and unpredictable, and it spirals toward greater violence. That's the natural trend of warfare once it's launched. And once it's launched, it can't be fully controlled, as much as we would like to think that we can control it. I trust that NATO allies will take the right lessons from what we're watching unfold. Not a lesson that we're better, but a lesson that we have a lot of work to do to be prepared for and proficient in high-intensity conflict and to be ready for the fog and friction of war. The U.S. is committed to standing by its transatlantic allies in this regard as well. Second, there's no substitute for strong, clear, and effective leadership. Now, Russia's experienced significant command control communications failures in this war. We've watched that. They started with a plan based on flawed assumptions, executed with insufficient forces. And those forces were unprepared for the tasks that they were assigned. Tactical and operational communications have been jammed and otherwise problematic, and coordination among tactical and operational commanders doesn't even today appear to exist in any solid form. You know that soldier morale and readiness is low, and their casualties have been extremely high, really approaching what they experienced in 10 years of war in Afghanistan, and as the Soviets fighting there. Though Russia launched a modernization program in 2010, putting forth claims that they were instilling new doctrine that advanced the use of initiative at lower levels, at the tactical level, and a modernization of their force. We've seen very little evidence of these changes in the way Russia's prosecuted this campaign. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army and civilian resistance has rallied in an incredibly brave and effective manner under the strong leadership of President Zelensky. The Ukrainians may be outnumbered and outgunned, but they're not outled. We must keep this in mind as we educate and train the next generation of leaders for our defense forces. It is clear that rigorous training is invaluable. The difference between the Ukrainian forces of 2014 and today, and between the Ukrainian forces today and the Russian forces today, is in a large part due to the training by NATO allies since 2014. You can see the impact and effectiveness as well with which the Ukrainians are using the weapons that we provided to them, especially the anti-armor, the anti-air, the long-range precision munitions, to great effect. Clearly, air defense is still a concern for them. That's one of their top asks today. But it's notable to me that the Russians have been unable to gain air superiority in this campaign at all. Now that leads me to lesson 3. It's critical that we invest in cutting-edge modern defense capabilities. For example, in the U.S., each of our armed services are investing in 30-year capabilities for the future. The Air Force in fifth-generation fighters, the Army in next-generation helicopters and precision fighters, and the Navy in next-generation submarines, fifth-generation fighters, and new frigates. Critical in this is enhanced connectivity between all of these domains through data transfer and interoperability. That's really the glue that brings this together and makes it most effective. A connected force is fundamental to the ways the U.S. sees success in the battlefield. This year, the Department of Defense published its Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2, implementation plan, focused on dramatically increasing the speed and information sharing and the decision-making in a contested environment. In the 1980s, we learned the importance of joint combined arms operations as we developed the air-land battle, fighting the Soviet Union, for instance. Now, advancing joint multi-domain, multinational interoperability is more important than ever. Our industry partners rely on demand signal from governments and to advance these capabilities, and this war has shown that the demand is there. NATO needs to make sure that the strategic underpinnings which guide our defense framework, as well as capabilities we are building, align with the realities we see in Europe today. As we see now, the difficulty of sourcing and building what we need has starkly revealed the risks of our defense industry capacity from years of underinvestment, and that we falsely hope to remedy that all at once if war comes. With this in mind, I'm encouraged by the approval of the Alliance's Concept for Deterrence and Defense, or the DDA, the SAC-EUR strategy as well. I'm glad to see it nested in a greater NATO strategic concept approved at the Madrid summit. I was also glad to see NATO establish a Defense Innovation Acceleration and Multinational Innovation Fund to foster collaboration between governments, industry, and academia in pursuit of technological advancement and greater interoperability. So looking ahead, thank you. I understand you have a pressing meeting, and I appreciate it. I'm just about to wrap up, so you've heard the most of it. Thank you. Thank you, Mitch. You're welcome. Thank you. So just a second, and I'll be done, and we can move on. So looking ahead, I think this is likely going to be a grinding war, one that will go on for quite some time. I don't see either side having the capability to win or have a decisive victory. And so instead, both sides will likely reach a stalemate, at which point Putin will look to buy time, to regroup, and to try to maintain his objectives at a later date. We've seen this Russian playbook before, right? Putin's strategy has been to use a negotiating table as a de-escalation chip for the West, putting the longevity of international sanctions on Russia at risk and potentially driving a wedge between the countries here in Europe and the U.S. In my opinion, a ceasefire is not necessarily a win. And if and when a ceasefire comes, there are several imperatives. The first, that NATO and the international community must continue to keep pressure on Russia. Putin has clearly shown his true nature. We can't fall back on hope as a method of peace. Second, NATO must have one voice. It has to remain unified. Significant divergence will only serve as fodder for Putin. We must, third, support Ukraine's survival as an independent state and continue to resource them at speed. Reflecting on my experience as both a SACEUR and a former commander of U.S. forces in Korea, we need to remember that European security is inseparable from global security. Whether or not the alliance wants to think about China, China's thinking about the alliance. As we all know, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is about more than a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty as well. What is at stake is not only the future of Ukraine and the European security framework, but the preservation of international norms of respect for territorial integrity and the democratic principles of freedom and independence that we love. And so even though this is taking place in Europe, this is ultimately about global security in my view. Now, I'd like to conclude by again thanking all of you for all that you do, for your resiliency and partnership in this collective fight to protect freedom and the values that we hold most dear. The United States, I assure you, will stand side by side with Italy in defense of democracy and defense of freedom and security. So thank you again for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here and for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Generale Scaparrotti. Io ringrazio naturalmente il Generale Portolano, il Capo di Stato Maggiore della Difesa e il Sottosegretario che sono andati via per la coincidenza della cerimonia al Quirinale, ma li ringraziamo per essere stati con noi. E come immaginavamo la sua Lexio si è incentrata su quella che è attualmente la sfida più grande per l'Alleanza Atlantica, cioè la pace in Europa che non c'è più, quindi il conflitto in Ucraina. Dopo 33 anni dalla caduta del muro di Berlino, ecco, con la guerra in Ucraina la Russia ci ha ricordato che la pace, la libertà e la democrazia, come ha detto nel suo discorso il generale Scaparrotti, non sono mai al sicuro nel vecchio continente. Ecco, ora le rivolgerò qualche domanda per approfondire degli aspetti che sicuramente il pubblico italiano diciamo, a cui sarà sicuramente interessato, perché la guerra in Ucraina sicuramente, poi anche l'allargamento della NATO verso Finlandia e Svezia ha spostato un po' a nord, ecco, l'interesse della NATO e la paura dei paesi del sud è che rimanga più scoperto il fianco appunto meridionale. Come può la NATO gestire questo rischio e qual è, ecco, secondo lei il ruolo dell'Italia in questo scenario sempre più complesso? Prego.
Thank you, Flavia. If I could, I would reframe the question just a bit in my response, if I might be able to do that. And I would do it in this way. I would say that certainly the focus, perhaps not the center of gravity, but the focus has certainly shifted to the east with the conflict in Ukraine, and also what will very soon be an addition of Finland and Sweden to the alliance. But I point this out because several reasons. One is that what we see in high-intensity conflict today in modern warfare, particularly with adversaries that have modern weapons, use of emerging technology, is that the conflicts aren't localized. They can't be contained. Ukraine itself is having regional and global impact on the countries around the world. So that's the first reason I say that. The second is that within NATO, we've worked hard. The new Deterrence and Defense for the Transatlantic, the DDA, and that defense posture that was put in place by NATO specifically takes a look at the defense of the transatlantic holistically. When I was SACEUR, I worked hard to try and talk about not north, south, east, and west, but the defense of the transatlantic. And certainly there's important in each of the areas, like the South. But to understand it's all connected. When you look at the campaigns today, when you look at Russia, for instance, as they conduct operations in Ukraine, they simultaneously are doing operations in Syria. They have forces that influence the Black Sea. They have a port in Tarsa in the Mediterranean in Syria. They have forces that are in the Arctic, in the high north, and they sortie very capable submarines into the Atlantic and other ships. It's 360. And so it is, again, to try and impress upon everyone the idea that we're connected and the defense is holistic. Now, with respect to the South, I pointed out Russia's capability in the Mediterranean, and Italy plays a critical role here. You always have. You provide a ready and a consistently modernizing force that has taken a lead voluntarily in NATO. Italy often provides the leadership, much as you do today in the mission in Iraq. You are often a framework nation, as you were in Afghanistan, and you always step up in NATO. And it's particularly important in the Mediterranean because where you're located. So I think you do play a critical role in that. The modernization and the readiness of your forces to be relevant to this emerging security environment, I think is very important too.
Thank you. Parliamo di capacità. La guerra in Ucraina ha sicuramente evidenziato il cosiddetto ritorno alle operazioni militari tradizionali, diverse sicuramente dagli scenari a bassa intensità come l'Afghanistan. Sta emergendo chiaramente un quadro di vulnerabilità, ecco, per alcune capacità dispiegate in Ucraina e la necessità sicuramente di svilupparne di nuove. Che tipo di risposta ci si aspetta dai paesi della NATO, dalle forze armate e dall'industria della difesa? Siamo consapevoli che negli Stati Uniti c'è stata un'accelerazione nell'ultimo periodo nello sviluppo di nuove capacità come l'ipersonico, il fuoco di precisione, gli elicotteri di nuova generazione. Prego.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. You know, it's interesting, as you look at Ukraine today, you see everything from the very effective use of small special operations teams and even conventional teams built around new technology, working in small groups and indirect attacks on the Russians and being very effective. You also see the Russians using large armored and mechanized forces. You see the use of long-range precision munitions on one hand by the Ukrainians very effectively, and you still see the Russians employing massed artillery in a very destructive way, as they have traditionally throughout World War II and beyond. So I bring this up because I think that what we see is the changing character of war. But it's too early in this war to say that we can determine the playbook. We've got to continue to watch this, and we have to be pressing ahead on these new emerging technologies and in modernization to ensure that we're on the leading edge of that. Because the key to this will be is how do they integrate? Where do they come together? The force that really understands that is the one that will be the dominant one, in my opinion, in the future. Now, having said that, I think I'll mention several, there are more than a few, but several things that I think are clear from this conflict to answer your question. The first is the importance of sufficient war reserves and a strong industrial base. All of our countries right now are perhaps scrambling to provide the equipment, the munitions, and the needs of Ukraine, but we're also having to backfill our own war reserves as a result. And we recognize, because of this high-intensity conflict, we're reminded again that the expenditure of munitions, the loss of equipment, the destruction happens at a much greater pace than we experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan. So our industrial base becomes very important because our ability to just turn the switch on if we get into a war isn't realistic anymore. So we have to pay attention to our sufficient war reserves and our industrial base. The second is the impact of sophisticated modern weapon systems. And I just need to mention, you can see what we have supplied to Ukraine, trained them to use, and the effect that they're having with one or two well-placed long-range precision missions, the effect that they're having with unmanned aerial systems, the effect that they're having with sophisticated aerial defense systems, for example. That's a lesson here as well that we need to take away and continue to work together on the future. Related to that is the need to invest in next generation systems. Italy has invested in the F-35, fifth generation. We need to do so in our other systems. The beauty of next generation system is that they can be interlinked. They can be connected. And in that connection, they have great speed and much greater synergy and effect. The linkage of ground systems, sensors of all kinds, with space, with air, and with, for instance, next generation helicopters, as we're doing in the United States, I think is important. And then finally, that is connected to interoperability and its importance. And we see that in Ukraine in spades. And because we fight as an alliance, we have to prioritize interoperability.
Thank you. Qual è la sua opinione sul processo di integrazione avviato tra la NATO e la difesa europea? Come vede le ambizioni, ecco, dell'Europa per un'autonomia strategica che includa, ecco, in linea di principio forze comuni e una base industriale più unita?
Well, thank you. This is always an important question. In the time that I was a SACEUR as well, and I think it's a critical one, actually. You know, the EU and NATO, for instance, have a different purpose and mission. But beyond that, they share common values. They share the defense of a common territory and people. And they share really a common military force. There's not more than the one that we have. And I think it's dangerous to expect that we can separate them. So in that regard, they have to work together. And I think also that there's synergy with them working together. The EU's expertise is in diplomacy and economy. NATO's is in defense. And in today's world, using all of your elements of power together is what's crucial. And that just, to me, underscores the importance of NATO and EU being even closer and being more collaborative. As I've said in the past, though, I would say that with respect to the forces, Europe should continue to strengthen its European forces, to have the capability to act independently when you or a group of nations believes that you need to do so. I think that's natural. But I think that can all be done and must be done within the alliance, with all of us having one standard. We can't have two standards for our force structure, for our data transfer, for things like that. It won't work. None of us have the budget or the resource to do it separately. So there again, I think that we must all continue to strengthen our forces, but we've got to do it as one.
Last question about cooperation Italy-US. Ecco, le nostre forze armate lavorano insieme da 20 anni, dai Balcani all'Iraq, dove l'Italia poi ha preso da poco, ecco, il comando della missione NATO, passando poi per l'Afghanistan. Ecco, lo stesso vale per l'industria della difesa statunitense e quella italiana. Ad esempio la partnership tra Roma e Washington è solida, come ad esempio è stato dimostrato nel programma F-35 anche con la FACO di Cameri, e continuerà sicuramente con altri programmi di cooperazione futuri. Ecco, qual è la sua prospettiva a riguardo?
Well, I would just reinforce what I said earlier. One, I want to thank Italy for the leadership that you've demonstrated. Our close relationships based on the fact that we've worked together over the years in many places, many of them dangerous, and we have very close relationships. Luciano expressed that in one way in our relationship, right? It's just one of those of many American and Italian leaders that have worked together. I and Salvatore have a close relationship as a result. Italy provides critical leadership. Italy provides modern and ready forces. That's important to both of our countries. You mentioned the F-35. Italy is one of the first nations that took part in this program and plays a critical role and an evolving and developing role in the F-35. I hope that and am confident that you'll continue to play that role in future next generation systems in multi-domain operations. I think you have an opportunity here with next generation fast helicopter development, etc. Much like we're working with future vertical lift in the United States, I think there's an opportunity for our countries to work together there. So I think this is a great relationship. I expect it to continue to grow and be strong, and I'm appreciative of the partnership that we have with Italy.
Bene, io sono felice di chiudere con le parole del generale Scaparrotti che ci ricordano naturalmente il profondo legame che unisce l'Italia e gli Stati Uniti in nome di valori comuni ispirati alla libertà, alla democrazia e anche alla pace. Un'architettura sicuramente che potremo assicurare nel futuro grazie alla presenza della NATO nel vecchio continente. Ringrazio il generale Michael Scaparrotti per essere stato con noi, ringrazio naturalmente tutte le autorità che sono intervenute e ringrazio Raffaele Marchetti e la Luis per aver promosso questa iniziativa insieme a Formiche. Io saluto tutti i rappresentanti delle istituzioni e vi do appuntamento a una prossima iniziativa. Grazie a tutti.
Thank you, President.